taken. We got permission, and we're going to put it up on the internet. And at the end of this, you can ask questions, right? But if you have a real good question during it, just raise your hand and stop me. Okay, burial grounds of Granby and South Hadley throughout their histories. That means as long as there have been people in Granby, we're going to talk about those cemeteries they might have been buried in. And it includes South Hadley. Okay. Well, that's just my head. All right, so we're at the Granby Free Public Library, and we want to figure out where all these buried local cultural council. And I told you who I am. My website is very easy to access. And along the left edge of my website has many tabs. And one of them will say communities of Hamden, Hampshire County, and you can find a lot on Granby. Okay, and I am promoted by, for 10 years now, the Holy Preservation Trust. And they have been great to me, trying to get people to come to my tours and to attend my indoor events. And like I mentioned, there's other things on the sheet. And every year, the past 10 years, I have a new charity, always in Hoyle, and always a charity that serves younger people or people that are poorer off. This Lighthouse Holyoke is an alternative school, and it's found on Ray Street in Holyoke. And if you have an extra $5 or $10, you can electronically send them some money or a check. And it's up to you, of course. And I do all my work either based by going out in the field into cemeteries or canals, or I do a lot of the work in libraries. I try to figure out from the actual primary in Granby, where would they have been buried? And also, Granby was officially a town in 1768. So why these particular lie of dates? All right, so the first settlers of South Hadley and Granby, when they died, they would have been brought back to the old Hadley Cemetery. Okay, now, it's not known exactly who that would be, right? But it was the only cemetery that served Hadley, and Granby and South Hadley. Look at Holyoke's list of death, and you'll find out very quickly, a third of all the death on any sheet from 1900 is a child. But information like that doesn't exist anymore. Towns weren't required absolutely to keep records until 1841. And before that, churches would have kept records, but a lot of the church records are gone. But we do know for sure another fact, that the old South Hadley Cemetery was founded in 1727. And that became thus the burial ground for Granby. Okay, so for 6 years it was Old Hadley Cemetery. From 1727 to 1764, it was the cemetery for anyone that was in Granby. And that's a long period of time. And the people that were buried there, anyone that had a stone, they're known because there's been so many translations of who was there by using those old gravestones. Now, peculiar fact, if you had thought about, oh, what's the oldest cemetery in Granby nowadays, most people would have said West Street Cemetery. But it's not true. Why is the North Cemetery older by 5 years? That's a very interesting fact. Okay, so the old Hadley Cemetery, wonderful cemetery, we'll visit. It has all the pioneers there. This is one of the table gravestones. It's raised above the ground by 5 legs. Okay, now North Cemetery in Granby. So that's the first one we want to talk about in Granby. I'm skipping the old Hadley Cemetery for now. I put the very end, it's very complex. the Memorial Cemetery in Granby, founded 1764. And why was it even founded before there was even a Granby? Why do they keep putting people into the old South Hadley burial ground? My theory, and it's backed up, is that that cemetery is a Baptist cemetery. And the Baptists wanted to be far away from all the congregations, whether it was a church or a cemetery or a village. And so Street was found by Baptists, and they put their homes there. They didn't have enough money to build a church, but the former house that was one above the cemetery as you drive out of Street, the house is not there anymore. That was the reverend's house, and he had the mass on Sunday in his house. Okay, so this started in 1764, and that mass, those Baptist people, had also people from Belchtown come to their services. Okay, but remember, it was still South Hadley at that point. Okay, now, who was the first person that died? And he moved out to Wilbraham. And in Wilbraham, this son still exists. Levi Clark. People say that stone says he's 1 year old. A person that translated the stone in 1935 said it was 8 years. But anyway, Levi Clark is there. And also his daughter, a child of only 14 weeks old, Ruth Clark, is also buried there. She's the third burial there. And another woman, her name was Martha Ayers. She was buried second. So these three still have their stones there. Okay, so what's going on? That's really interesting. Here's Levi Clark's stone. Hard to read. So you might ask, why am I saying what I'm saying next? Well, in 1935, a person that was a wonderful genealogist, he went from communities to community, building up information on cemeteries and vital records. And his name was Walter Corbin, and what he did was he wrote out this kind of card for every stone he found in the cemetery, and he did it by rows, and then also 6 is the number of row, 2 is the number of the stone into that row, which matches the Levi Clark. And then he wrote down everything he found on the stone. Now remember, this is the first burial in what would become Granby. And he is telling you exactly what he wrote down. He's saying this child, Levi, is 8 years old. And then he wrote down in the epitaph. And the epitaph is there, and I wrote it out for you on the next slide. Okay, and that's what it says. All right, I don't have to read the top part, but I will read the bottom part, because I was able to figure out the missing word. He had written 1935 dash 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 for one of the words, and that was the 5th word long. So I was able to figure out what it was. And it said, "Here I've begun a congregation, which you now hear me see. It won't be long ere you will throng into the grave with me. This I have said as from the dead, therefore get ready to, for you must when you ask." Now there's probably a word after the 2, there's definitely a word after the ask. But what it's saying here, I've begun a congregation. And what that means is that here in the cemetery, I am the first burial. The stone is telling you that this person is the first burial. And this is not very common at all. And I've Googled lots of parts of this epitaph. It was never used again except one place. Okay? So there's 2 places, 2 gravestones in the whole world where the epitaph says this. And it's also telling you that it's the start of North Cemetery, the first white settler ever to die. Okay, now, I had figured this out last year. In the beginning of this year, I got back to North Cemetery, and I said, oh, I wish I knew that word. Rural Cemetery in Belchtown. And remember I told you that the Baptists on Bachelor Street were getting together with the Baptists that were in Belchtown, and they were living in the closest road nearby in Belchtown, the closest to Granby. And that's a road called Rural, now called R-U-E-L, Rural Street, very close to Granby. And I went to the cemetery that's on that street, and I knew it was a Baptist cemetery, very old. And the first burial there has the same epitaph on it. And so I was able to, this one was a little easier to read, but I was able to use Walter Corbin's transcriptions from 1935. And what did it say? It gave me the fifth word. So in this cemetery also, same as on Bachelor Street, you have the same epitaph being used because it was the same Baptist congregation in two different communities, but the same group was using it. So in both cemeteries, I now have the first burial. And notice here, you have the headstone that's facing towards you, and you have a footstone in back. And that's the way any pre-1850 alignment and arrangement of gravestones should be. They should be aligned in a certain direction. And whenever I go to an old cemetery, I bring this. Why would I bring this? A compass. And I make sure I get my north, and thus I come east and west. Well, it turns out that old burials were lined up so that the head of the person was facing towards the west, the feet of the person were facing towards the east, and then a straight line from west to east, you'd have the burial, 6 feet down. The headstone would be at the head of the person, of course, headstone, but it would face out from the person's head towards the west. The footstone would be at the foot of the person, and it would face in the other direction from the person, and in the other direction from the headstone, it would face towards the east. So both stones would face out from the person. The footstone would face towards the east. The reason why they did that, and it almost always in the perfect line to the east, is because on a Revelation day, supposedly the person would be resurrected, and they would rise, their upper torso would rise up and see the resurrection day, and they'd be looking towards the east, and it was thought that the resurrection would come from the east because the sun comes from that direction. So burials were always done that way. If you're ever in a cemetery that has pre-1850 stones and it's not lined up, someone moved them. If you're ever in a cemetery where the headstone does not point inscription towards the west, then someone moved it. If you're ever in a cemetery and there's no footstones at all, someone threw them up. And that is very common. There's about 10 headstones left. All of them are in the Bath Street Cemetery. 0 in the West Street Cemetery. Okay, and this is showing you one of the few examples, happens to be in Belchtown, one of the few examples where everything I described is perfect. East-west alignment, inscription heading directly toward the east, footstone looking directly towards the west. Right, and I have a picture of these two together. You see behind it the footstone pointing in the opposite direction. One of the fewest examples I've ever seen, and I've gone to maybe 200 cemeteries. I finally found one this year. They're very rare. Okay, now what about the West Street Cemetery? The West Street Cemetery, founded in 1769. I believe it's founded July 4th, 1769. And every town needs to have a cemetery according to the old rules of Massachusetts law. You need a school, you need a church, you need a cemetery. Okay, when someone dies, you better have one ready. They didn't have one ready, but they get one ready very quick. Okay, now when you go into the West Cemetery, the headstones are pointing inscription towards the west. So they've done that right, the stones have never been moved. And there's a proper amount of distance between each row of headstones, because the typical adult burial is 7 feet, so they always left at least 7 feet. And then a person would have to walk between the footstone of the person and the headstone of the next person. So they always put 2 feet. So 7 plus 2, they always put 9 feet between rows. And in Granby, they are with 9 feet of space between. So no one has moved the stones out of the alignment from the compass, and they haven't moved the rows. And most of the stones still exist. I know that because that translator person, 1935, wrote his cards out, and most of them are still around. But the footstones are gone. Some superintendent along the way threw them into the trash. People would go to the cemetery and say, oh, I'm building a new sidewalk on my land, let's take some of these stones. And they're gone. Okay, now the first burial was Rose Smith. It's a young girl. Her death was July 4th, 1769. And the deed has been found for the West Street Cemetery, and that says on it, July 10th, 1769. Okay, now, notice that the deed came to Granby 6 days after she died. And she's the first person there. So 2 things could have happened. And she's one of only 6 of the hundreds of old-time burials pre-1855. There's only 6 stones where the headstone faces the wrong way. It faces towards the east. Her father happens to be one of those stones too. So I'm wondering one of 2 thoughts. Is Rose Smith, was she the first burial here? And that's her true stone? And the stone fell over at some point, and then whoever put it back up turned it around? Maybe. Or was she actually buried in this old South Hadley cemetery because Granby did not have a cemetery yet? Because 6 days later, they would receive the deed for that land. Now, who gave the deed? A person named James Smith. Was this a relative of her father, like her father's brother? And said, oh, why don't we bury her on the family farm? And then 6 days later, the deed would go over to Granby officially. That's probably more likely, but this mystery of why are stones backwards when so few are, that bothers me still. There must be a reason. Okay, now, this person, Samuel Dickinson, Walter Corbin, 1935, he went around writing down all the old-time inscriptions and all the stones found in the old cemetery, part of that cemetery. And there was also a transcription done in 1902 on the old South Hadley cemetery. And his name was on that transcription. So we know that he, Samuel Dickinson, was buried in the old South Hadley cemetery in 1751. Well, look at the date, 1751. There are no cemeteries in Granby yet. So thus, he was buried in the old South Hadley burial ground. But in 1903, it's known that he was moved to Granby. Because the Dickinson family of Granby knew that cemetery in South Hadley was being moved into the back of Evergreen Cemetery in South Hadley. They showed up that year and they said, when you're moving his body, contact us. We're gonna bring his body and his stone to where his family is buried in Granby. Now, when I go out and try to find Samuel Dickinson, sadly, he's gone. The stone is gone. And I know where it should be. 23rd row, 20th burial along that row. I think I found the 23rd row, and I go out, I can't find it. I try a few other nearby rows, I can't find it. So maybe the stone wore out, maybe they threw it out too when they moved his body. Either is possible. Okay, so we know what the stone looked like though. Look in the very bottom, it was a brownstone. So this wonderful person told you what it looked like. There's also Samuel Moody buried in South Hadley, and we know that he's on another card like this. So there's another person that I can prove was in South Hadley and was moved. But his stone's gone too. Okay, and that's not the only movement into Granby's West Street Cemetery. This stone is very easy to find. Look on the one on the far right. And to find it, the West Street Cemetery is really divided into three parts. The very bottom part is everything you see when you enter the cemetery. The Victorian part from 1890 to about the 1930s is everything you see in the evergreen section of that cemetery. It's the middle third. And this burial stone is in that portion there. Why? Because some point in the 1930s, Quabbin Reservoir's coming around, and what they do, the state controlled how the burials were going to be moved, and they did it in a wonderful manner. South Hadley, when they moved theirs, did not have the ability to say, oh, okay, we'll help you, we'll get your permission, right? The state could find all the burials ancestors, or descendants, sorry, and ask for permission, and it gave them the right to bury their ancestor anywhere in the United States they wanted to, and to move the stone with it. One family who had lived in the Quabbin were in the 1930s out in California, and they told the state, bring the bodies out to California, bring the stones here too. They put them on a train, and they're out in California. But a family in Granby wanted one or two of the burials moved into Granby's West Street Cemetery. There it is in 1930s, very clean and complete. Notice the top is gone. But in the 1930s, the state wrote down every inscription, wrote down the location of every cemetery and what was in it. They also took a picture of every stone before it was moved. So you have a 1930s picture and a 2014 picture, and it's been damaged since, and it's dirtier, but it's very easy to clean. If you use a chemical called D2, you can clean that up within an hour to look brand newer like the 1930s. Okay, now remember I told you about Rose Smith? This is her father. This is her mother. The headstones are point opposite each other, but they're tied together because one is braced up with metals, the bigger one, and the smaller one is cracked, so they hooked it up to the mother. So the husband and wife team are together, and Roche's stone is off to the side. Okay, so I thank Terry in the back of the room, because she told me, yes, there are Native Americans buried in Granby. Of course there are. Of course there are, because Native Americans have been around for 10,000 years. Of course there's any burials in Granby. But the problem is, either two problems. Either the body's so disintegrated, even when you dig a basement, you're not gonna figure out there's a burial there. Or if the burial was more than, say, 200 years ago, then you might find it, maybe you don't recognize it, but for Native Americans, you should. Because almost all Native Americans in New England were buried in the following manner: legs outwards, and the upper torso upwards. So body up, legs out. And then almost always, they packed them on red clay. And that has been found over and over again, hundreds of times around New England. Very rarely do you find them straight up. Okay, so Native American boy and girl were found in the backyard of 128 Pleasant Street. How could you find a burial by just doing a very simple plow through a field? Remember, the burials torso up, which might mean that the head of the person was only 1 or 2 feet below the surface of the earth. So they were able to find them. And usually what happens, I think they found them 1960s, 50s, yeah. Usually what happens, pre-1992, they would call a museum and they'd come and get them. If you ever find a burial on land that you own, and you think it's less than 100 years old, you have to call the police. If you think it's more than 100 years old, you have to get in contact with the museum, and they cannot keep the burial. They have to give them to a Native American tribe. They cannot keep them. So we're doing both South Hadley and the stuff, and 4 burials have been found in South Hadley. Strangely enough, my nephew would buy the home on Main Street where the burial was found in the 19-teens. And so thus I was able to go to the house and tell them where the burial was, because the newspaper article said where the burial was. Okay, now we'll go through the Jewish one kind of quickly, because I don't know how many old-time Jewish burials there were in Granby. They would go to Chicopee, Hoyoke, Springfield, Northampton. They would not go out into the rural or suburban locations. But just for completeness, I'll tell you what the Jewish cemeteries are. They were actually very close to Granby. The Sons of Zion Cemetery is on Ludlow Road, very close to New Ludlow Road. And there's 2 cemeteries that are Jewish in Chicopee, because there's 2 congregations in Hoyoke. And on the upper part of Pendleton Avenue in Chicopee, called the Rafi Sholem Cemetery. And when you bury a Jewish person, you bury them opposite sense of Protestants, so they're buried head to torso, but if they ever rise at the resurrection, they would be facing the west. I don't understand that, but they do. They bury them in a shroud, they put them in the ground without a coffin. Except when it's a rabbi, and a rabbi is the founder of a very important rabbi, then they put them in above ground mausoleums. And that's what you're looking at here. He was the rabbi of both congregations. Okay, so what about the Catholics? Now, the Catholics probably did come out to Granby because there were grist mills around. And some of the hired hands in these grist mills might have been Catholics, right? Most of them would have stayed in the industrial cities, but they would have started coming out towards Granby, I'm pretty sure, by the 1880s. Either to live here or to work here. Okay, and I'll do a few of the very old-time Catholic ones. You notice I have the one in Boston, and I'll show you the slide on that. because there was no Catholic cemetery in Western Massachusetts until the third entry down. That means the St. Matthew Cemetery in Springfield, 1845. That's the first ever Catholic cemetery in Western Massachusetts, 1845. Right, and this list is kind of reproduced on a sheet I handed out to you in the very beginning. And here's that first one, St. Augustine. The chapel is nearby, and the cemetery is right alongside it. There also was one in Hartford they started using. But most importantly, the St. Matthew Cemetery in Springfield. They would use this heavily. And I don't know if anyone from Granby or South Hadley used it in the very beginning. Probably not. But if they did, their burial probably is without a stone. I've counted, by using finding grade, 400 names in it. And then I paced out this cemetery, and I determined there's about 8,000 burials in this cemetery, 400 inscriptions of names on stone. Why so low a rate? Because the Catholics were so poor, they could not afford a stone. And then the next one that would be heavily used by Granby and South Hadley would be the Calvary Cemetery in Chicopee, a very large cemetery. If you want to find it, go to the very southernmost point of Chicopee. It's on Hampton Street, near Springfield Street, and that opened in 1851. This is the second Catholic cemetery in Western Massachusetts, and I'm pretty sure there would be a few Catholics from Granby and South Hadley in there. And it was the only one they could have used up to 1866, when the next one came around, and that would be the St. Jerome Cemetery. They started it up in 1864, and it was ready for burials in 1866. You probably know this cemetery. You might have gone there too, because a lot of people from Granby and South Hadley were definitely buried in this cemetery. It was known as the Holyoke Catholic Cemetery, abbreviated HCC on burial records, and Holyoke put down the burial cemeteries. In Chicopee is still one of the few communities in Western Massachusetts that actually did. Okay, now, getting really close to home, and now I've seen burial records of Granby people that says Precious Blood Cemetery. So I know that they're using it. But who's using it? In 1866, you have the St. Jerome's, up to 1874, when Precious Blood Cemetery starts to open up. Now you finally have a division by ethnic groups. So the St. Jerome's was being used, and the French Canadians were using it, but Precious Blood opens up. And the first burial is 1875 into Precious Blood Cemetery. And I've seen Granby people being buried here, French Canadians are being buried here. It was the most popular cemetery for Catholic French Canadians who were living in Granby. And that's because it was right along 202. It's actually officially on Route 33, but it's right off of Route 202. Very easy to get to. And it started up in a very horrible state, because the first burials were on May 27, 1875. There was a wooden church in Holyoke called the Precious Blood Church. On that day in 1875, 71 people, 600 people were inside. 71 people would die from the fire or be injured seriously enough from the fire that they would die in the days and weeks afterwards. And this stone was put up about 20 years ago by the Catholic diocese. Right, and the priest is nowadays buried there. That's a stone in that. His stone used to be next to the church, They moved his body when the church was taken down in 1989. Okay, now in the St. Rose Cemetery, definitely Granby people are there. I was able to prove to a person I know, her great-grandmother had died in Granby, and she asked me, where is she buried? And I was able to prove to her where she was. And the St. Rose Cemetery was very popular for Granby residents on Route 202, but it serves both French Canadians and Irish by design. So you go walking through it, it has both styles of names, the French Canadian and the Irish names. The reason why I have this picture in particular, he was a Confederate soldier, and he was buried with a Confederate insignia alongside his gravestone, right there. There's also, in the Westry Cemetery in Granby, another Confederate soldier. Okay, but Notre Dame Cemetery is extremely popular with Granby residents for French-Canadian Granby residents. And it's a very important cemetery because of what broke off of it. You see this line of evergreen trees right here? Until 1934, everything beyond that line of evergreen trees was part of Notre Dame Cemetery. And Notre Dame was such a good parish and loyal, and his pastor loved Granby so much, he actually gave his land to the monks, and they started up the Franciscan monastery. And he also gave a portion of his cemetery to the Mater Dei Rosa Church, and they used an old portion back here from the 1890s to 1934 until the land behind those trees was totally given to them. And so a large plot of land